Well, that was an interesting session. When you actually look at life sciences combined with what technology is doing to change that business model, that life cycle, it is quite amazing. And now to continue on this journey of looking at how digital at the very core is transforming the world around us and actually giving organizations a competitive advantage, I'm going to invite our second speaker today, someone I'm going to be in conversation with over the next few minutes. Again, from a very interesting and a very different industry, the financial services sector. One that I again believe is absolutely integral to what drives consumer behavior, what's changing in that consumer life cycle. With that, let me introduce to you our next speaker today, Hood. Hood heads shared services and technology at BNY Mellon. Someone who's been absolutely at the core of technology, transforming the bank's core platforms, transforming the front to back processes, absolutely at the core of the automation transformation agenda for the bank. Someone who also actually has served as head of India operations and technology, bringing together culture, purpose, several other elements for the bank, and with technology at the core. Pleasure to have you here with us today, Hood. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Shalini, for having me, and great session with Liz.
Thank you. Thank you, and looking forward to the next few minutes with you. And as we get started and warmed up, Hood, I cannot help but open this up to really talk about specifically what the last 18 months have been like. I mean, the world has seen technology adoption at a really frantic pace, almost like there's no tomorrow. And would love to hear your thoughts on what this has meant for you in terms of an industry that is highly regulated, one that is experiencing customer consumer behavior like never before, preferences that we didn't even know existed, right? You've seen new entrants into the play. The lines that define financial services as a sector have blurred with all of what telecom and technology is doing to the sector. So we'd love to hear your views and your take on summing up what the last 18 months have been like as you see it.
It's a great question. So the last 18 months for me have been, I think for all of us, a giant experiment in whether or not we could work virtually. And I think we have a shared experience around products like Zoom or Teams. So I don't need to get into what we can do virtually. I think what that experiment has yet to deliver on is the gaps that have been left as a result of not being face-to-face. If we want to make a real case for change post-pandemic, the kind of change where working in a virtual environment becomes the norm, then I think we still have to discover and scale sustainable digital alternatives to a handful of what I consider the huge positives for being in the office, right? So those are things like we can break bread together. We can be in non-work mode with each other, that human connection that digital, I don't think yet fully delivers on. Second would be that we can whiteboard together in a way that picks up subtle facial signals, body language for everyone in the room, not just the one person that you're speaking with or the three people across the top. That includes like eye contact, fidgeting, crossed arms, yawns, human factors. The third gap that the digital, I think, has yet to deliver on is that we work harder when others are around us. That's a psychological truth. And that social influence aspect, that engagement aspect is something that we as a community need to really focus in on. And finally, we signal trust passively, communicating that we're actually working by just showing up at the office. And that's not necessarily true when I show up in Teams or Zoom. And that's very important because autonomy, which is a core principle for a lot of us, and definitely for where in financial services, engineering, autonomy needs transparency and trust. So the last 18 months have been an experiment. I think we still have some unresolved questions and a need to expand that experiment. But for the most part, we've been able to hit every client expectation, regulatory expectation, and peer expectation in an environment that it has, where digital has really stepped up to deliver.
Well, that's so beautifully summarized. I love the concept of this giant experiment, which still has gaps we need to bridge. And one couldn't have said it better, right? I mean, this virtual hybrid that we're all working in, and you gave some fantastic thoughts around how do you bridge those gaps, whether it is those little elements of human touch that are so critical. And I know AI has come a long way trying to do that, but there's so much longer to go in terms of bridging that gap. So that's a fantastic summary, Hood. As I kind of take away from that and yet look at what new technology is doing for us, there's so much spoken around how technology is driving innovation, delivering impact and outcome, making our world smaller, blurring geographical borders, and yet in all of this helping us get more resilient. It would be wonderful to hear you give us perhaps a few examples of what either you're working on or have experienced, or your thoughts. And maybe I'll take each of those one at a time. And the first one perhaps is your take on technology really driving innovation.
So it's an important question to ask. So a lot of companies today continue the thinking around having centers of innovation centers, where you take a floor in a 20-story tower and you say that the 15th floor is just, we're gonna make it look like Google. We're gonna just operate differently, and it's going to be a hotbed of innovation. And I think that's a great step forward if you didn't have that. But I do think that it begs the question, what about the other floors? We need to kind of move away from an innovation center mindset to an innovation everywhere mindset, where it's an expectation, a cognitive demand of every individual in a company to help pass raise that bar. And probably the best example is what the industry is calling low-code, no-code platforms, where we can take citizens and make them into citizen developers. So whether you are an engineer or a non-engineer, low-code, no-code platforms can allow that innovation mindset to be ubiquitous across the entire enterprise. So that's probably my one example.
And I love that. It kind of reminds you how technology is truly a leveler of sorts, right? I mean, suddenly there's a level playing field for everyone out there to contribute. And much has been spoken about innovation centers. And the minute you try to bring it everywhere, like you said, it just changes and multiplies the power of what you can achieve if you embed it across the organization. So that's absolutely fantastic. And moving from there, when you kind of hence look at technology delivering impact, again, innovation amongst all else, what would come to mind, Hood?
So for me, technology, when done correctly, does two things. It empowers our most resourceful talent, our people, to operate at the next level. And technology delivers on the promise of a better operating model. And it's that operating model impact that I think technology shines. Technology allows us to deliver a different operating discipline, to go from being regional to being genuinely global. And part of what we have to do is be intentional, Shalini, about that exact operating model change. I think technology's real impact is going to be how it transforms the way we work with each other across the globe. So part of, actually, this is probably a good area to edit, because I think I've spoken too much on it. so
No, but
let's
I have a follow-on to that, because you actually also head and oversee the India operations. And I'm curious, because this whole conclave Hood is about global capability center. So it's really speaking to the core of that operating model and how technology has actually enabled this. So given that you've been at the helm of setting up and running and managing something like this, how do you see this model when you really look at delivering impact? Any comments on that?
Absolutely. Look, the way we mature an operating model from what is fundamentally a regional mindset to a genuinely global mindset, I think it's a structural power play that we need to make. And what I mean by that is we still have across a lot of companies heads of India.
Mhm.
And my role, as an example, and I think places that have my role really need to struggle with whether or not they are moving towards a genuinely global operating model. That's a direct indictment of myself and my role. Why? Because what having a global head of India does is it allows the US and EMEA to think differently about important values like justice and equity, global justice, global equity. So let me give you an example. If half of my workforce is in India, in my company, and I look at the power structures of who reports to who at the highest levels. What a lot of companies continue to do is to say, I'm a senior person, I have 10 direct reports, half of my people are in India, and it's okay for one of my 10 direct reports to be the head of India.
Yeah.
I think it's fundamentally an inequity. It is a social justice issue. And if we are to take India to the next level, we have to challenge the underlying social dynamic and say that representative management globally should be an aspiration for all of us. So in that example where 50% of my employees work in India, 50% of my leadership should be in India. 50% of the functions that I support should be led out of India, without the last 20 years of excuses about our clients are in the US, or our seniors or our businesses in the US. That double standard of the last 20 years of excuses it is a double standard, because US businesses have clients in India. They have clients in the Pacific, Asia Pacific region, and they're not struggling managing them. So I do think that the maturity curve for those of us with a commitment to India is to not just use the language of partnership, which I think we all do, right? I think it's to rebalance the power structures that allow real power to continue to stay in the US and in EMEA. We're going to need champions, because the letting go of power is not something that the powerless do.
Right.
The sharing of power starts with those that have the power. And I think the role of leadership in India, myself included, should be to agitate for that change. Agitate is the right word, because we need a social movement. We need to think in terms of the dynamics of social movements, to be able to make that kind of change, that kind of purpose-driven change.
I absolutely love the way you champion the cause, and you kind of really sold on the model, right? You see how it kind of mirrors your global footprint, and hence rightfully levels, like you said, from a justice and parity perspective, and of course unleashes power of what you can do from a center out of here. And I'm kind of going to move to one final question for you, Hood, which is, when you, and some wonderful experiences, but when you look at you're staring into that crystal ball, gazing into the future, I'm very curious as to how and where do you see the future headed? And is there something about that future and what you see that also bothers you perhaps a bit?
I'll tie the answer, Shalini, back to what we just talked about. I think I'm hopeful that the maturing of the global model away from what is still in many places a regional model will allow the full potential of not just leaders, but the entire body that is our India workforce to really have the kind of autonomy, the kind of purpose that isn't there when we are staff augmentation. That purpose-driven future is the only future if we are to focus on the needs of both the East and the West. So my fear remains my fear of the last 50 years as I've lived, which is that arc of that longer arc of justice will take longer than maybe our kids deserve. So it's such an imperative for us to treat the interactions with our partners in the US and in EMEA with an urgency to change the structural problems that leave most of the power in the hands of the existing powerful.
And thank you for that, Hood. And I must admit, I haven't heard someone who's as focused on technology bring together the meaning of purpose as beautifully as you just summed it up, because you've kind of over the last few minutes taken us through how powerful technology can be in terms of bringing about that parity, in terms of driving innovation, and like you rightly said, not through an innovation center, but embedding it across the entire model, so to speak. And yet talking of how powerful the model can be in terms of delivering the impact. And yet I go back to where we started to say, this has been one big experiment, one giant experiment, like you rightly said, with a few critical gaps to be plugged. But with all of what technology promises to deliver, whether it's trying to simulate those sensory human traits that you called out, how do you replace or try and bring in the coffee machine conversations and the water cooler talks into, like you said, the feeling of breaking bread together and yet bring in working collaboratively. I think it's amazing what technology has the power to do, and yet speak and link to something that is so human, right? The power of purpose. So I thought this was fantastic.
I actually think you touched on it brilliantly, which is the real power of technology is to actually make us more human. And I think if we think of it that way, we have a brighter future ahead.
That's awesome. And on that note, Hood, I will sum up, because when we have leaders such as yourself, and as the industry looks at the models evolving, I think the human race is certainly headed in the right direction. So thank you yet again, Hood, for your time. It was wonderful chatting with you. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Shalini.